What if the person standing closest to you at the happiest moment of your life was quietly counting down the seconds until it became the worst night you ever lived through? What if you woke up the next morning and your own memory refused to tell you the truth? Not because you didn't want to remember, because somebody made absolutely sure that you couldn't. Somewhere between the laughter, the toast, and the last thing anyone can clearly recall, a line was crossed that cannot be uncrossed. And the man standing at the center of it has no idea yet how far the damage really goes. He thinks the worst part is the blank space in his memory. He has no idea that the blank space itself might have been the entire point. Before we go further, if you love deep, emotionally driven breakdowns of soap opera storytelling that go far beyond the surface, this is the place for it. I'm Adam, and this is Buzz Delight, where we dig into the psychology behind the drama instead of just repeating what already happened on screen. If that sounds like your kind of channel, tap subscribe, hit like, and share this with someone who needs to hear it, because what we're about to unpack is one of the most unsettling turns this show has attempted in a long time. Now let's get into it. The man at the center of this storm is Will Spencer. The woman quietly orchestrating it, according to the evidence stacking up around her, is Luna. And caught in the middle, without ever asking to be there, is Electra, the one person who has no idea that her entire relationship may already be standing on a foundation that was never real to begin with. This was supposed to be a good night. Will had just landed a promotion, the kind of milestone that should have been simple. Colleagues raising glasses, friends laughing a little too loud, someone queuing up music that was slightly too celebratory for the room. For once, Will wasn't managing a crisis or bracing for someone else's chaos. He was allowed to just enjoy being exactly where he was. That's what makes what came next so difficult to watch unfold. Because somewhere in that same room, unnoticed by almost everyone, was a woman who had already decided that this celebration belonged to her too. Not in the way Will's friends and colleagues understood it. In a much quieter, much more calculated way. Luna wasn't there to toast Will's success. She wasn't there to smile politely from a distance and let the night belong to somebody else's happiness. Every signal we've been given about her state of mind up to this point suggests she was there with an agenda, one she had almost certainly been rehearsing before she ever walked through the door. That's the part of this storyline that deserves real attention, because it's easy to reduce Luna to a simple label: obsessed, desperate, unstable. But those words flatten what's actually happening inside her. People don't wake up one day and decide to manipulate someone they claim to care about. That impulse builds slowly, fed by rejection, by watching someone choose another person again and again, by convincing yourself that the problem isn't the fact that he doesn't want you, but that he simply hasn't been given the right circumstances to realize he does. That kind of thinking is dangerous precisely because it doesn't feel like villainy from the inside. It feels like determination. It feels like love, at least to the person telling themselves the story. And that's exactly what makes Luna, if the darker read of her behavior proves accurate, such an unsettling presence in Will's life. She isn't operating like someone plotting revenge. She's operating like someone who has convinced herself that whatever she does next is simply correcting a mistake the universe made when it let Will end up with someone else. There's a specific kind of psychology at work in people who reach this point, and it's worth naming because it explains why Luna's behavior, if the show is building her toward genuine sabotage, doesn't read as random or impulsive. It reads as patient. It reads as someone who has spent a long time rehearsing a version of events in her own head where she isn't the obstacle in Will's life, but the answer to it. People who think this way tend to treat rejection not as information about what someone else wants, but as a temporary technicality, a problem of circumstance rather than a problem of feeling. Will chose Electra in this framework, not because he genuinely wants Electra, but because he hasn't yet been placed in the right situation to realize he wants Luna instead. That belief is what allows a person to justify almost anything to themselves. If you've convinced yourself that the outcome you want is also the outcome that's secretly best for the other person, then manipulating your way toward it doesn't feel like an act of harm. It feels like an act of patience, of finally doing what needs to be done after waiting long enough for the truth to reveal itself on its own. That's what should worry Electra, and honestly, what should worry the audience watching this unfold, more than any single dramatic act Luna might commit. It's not the drink, if that's really what happened. It's the mindset behind it. A person capable of framing manipulation as love isn't likely to stop after one attempt, because in her own internal story, she isn't the villain of this arc. She's the woman fighting for something she believes is rightfully hers, against odds she considers unfair rather than earned. For most of the night, nothing about the room suggested danger. Will was exactly where he should have been, doing exactly what anyone in his position would do, laughing with people who genuinely liked him, accepting congratulations he'd earned, letting himself relax in a way he doesn't often get the chance to. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's part of what makes this so cruel if the darker interpretation holds up. Will wasn't reckless that night. He wasn't chasing trouble or putting himself in a compromising position through his own carelessness. He was simply present at his own celebration, surrounded by people he trusted, in a space that should have been safe by every reasonable measure. And that is exactly the kind of environment a person with harmful intentions would look for. Not chaos, not suspicion. A room full of goodwill, where nobody is watching closely because nobody has any reason to. As the night stretched on, Will kept drinking, the way most people do at their own party. Nobody thought twice about it. Why would they? It was a celebration. A little excess is expected, even encouraged. But there's a difference between the normal, familiar haze of a good night out and something else entirely, and the show appears to be building toward exactly that distinction. Because somewhere in the middle of that night, Will's condition seems to have shifted in a way that goes beyond simple overindulgence. The kind of shift that isn't gradual and predictable the way alcohol usually is, but sudden, disorienting. The kind of change that makes you stop and ask yourself, even in the moment, whether something else is happening to your body that you don't have an explanation for. We have to be careful here because nothing has been confirmed outright, and this remains speculation built from the pattern the story is laying down rather than a stated fact. But the possibility being raised, quietly and carefully, is that Luna may have interfered with what Will was drinking that night. If that's true, then everything about this storyline changes in a single instant. This wouldn't be a story about a man who had a rough night and made questionable choices. It would be a story about a woman who took away his ability to make choices at all. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this narrative, because it reframes every single thing that happens afterward. If Will's memory loss is simply the product of drinking too much at his own party, that's an uncomfortable but familiar story, the kind soap operas have told 100 times before. But if his condition was engineered by someone else, deliberately, with intent, then this becomes something far more serious, something that isn't really about a relationship at all. It's about consent, autonomy, and what happens when someone decides those things don't apply to them if the outcome they want is important enough. And the most disturbing detail in all of this is timing. Because if this is what actually happened, Will may not understand the truth of his own night until long after the damage has already been done. By the time he starts asking the right questions, the story may have already been written for him, by someone else, in whatever version serves her best. Try to imagine that morning for a second. Not from the outside, the way we're watching it, but from the inside, the way Will has to live it. You open your eyes and your first instinct is relief, because you survived a party and your body is telling you it was a big one. Then the pounding starts. Then the fragments arrive. A laugh here, a song there, someone saying your name from somewhere nearby. And then, abruptly, nothing. Not haze, not blur. An actual gap, like someone reached into your night and simply removed a section of it. Most people, faced with that experience, will try to rationalize it first. That's a natural defense mechanism. You tell yourself you just had too much. You tell yourself everyone loses track of a detail or two after a big night. You try to laugh it off, even as some quieter part of you is already unsettled by how complete the emptiness feels, how it doesn't behave the way ordinary drunkenness usually does. Because ordinary intoxication tends to blur things, not erase them outright. There's usually a thread you can follow if you try hard enough, some sequence you can reconstruct even if the details are fuzzy. What Will appears to be facing is different, sharper, more absolute. The kind of gap that leaves you not just confused, but afraid, because on some level, your body already suspects something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. And this is where Luna's advantage, if she engineered any of this, becomes almost frighteningly effective. Because she doesn't need proof to control the narrative. She doesn't need evidence, witnesses, or a convincing story built on solid ground. All she needs is a man who cannot say with certainty what did or didn't happen, and a willingness on her part to fill that silence with whatever version benefits her most. Think about how easily that could unfold. She wouldn't need to lie loudly or dramatically. She could simply speak with calm, quiet confidence about a night Will has no ability to challenge her on. She could tell him he reached out to her. She could suggest that he invited her closer, that he wanted this, that whatever happened between them wasn't something she orchestrated, but something he chose. And because Will has nothing solid to push back with, no memory to contradict her, she could make her version feel less like a claim and more like a fact he simply failed to hold on to. That's the real weapon in this situation, and it's worth naming clearly because it's more dangerous than any single lie. Confusion. If Will cannot remember, then he cannot disprove anything Luna decides to say. And a person willing to exploit that gap isn't just committing an act of manipulation. They're rewriting reality itself for someone else, using the one tool that can't be argued with, his own uncertainty about his own experience. And Luna, based on everything we've seen of her pattern so far, is not someone inclined to let an opportunity like that pass by unused. But Will isn't the only person standing in the blast radius of whatever happened that night. Electra is, arguably, the most vulnerable person in this entire situation, because she's the one who has to process everything secondhand, filtered through incomplete information, conflicting emotions, and the particular kind of dread that comes from sensing something is wrong long before you understand why. Picture the moment she first senses something off. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It could be something as small as an unfamiliar tone in Will's voice, a hesitation where there normally wouldn't be one, a detail that doesn't quite line up with the story he's telling. Or it could be far more direct, a photo that shouldn't exist, a message that implies something it shouldn't, a comment from someone who saw more of that night than Will remembers seeing himself. If Luna is playing this the way her behavior suggests, she wouldn't need to manufacture a scandal from nothing. She would only need to plant a seed, one carefully placed detail designed to make Electra's imagination do the rest of the work for her. That's a particularly cruel form of manipulation because it doesn't require sustained effort. It requires one moment of doubt, planted at exactly the right time, and then simply waiting for that doubt to grow on its own. And for Electra, the emotional math here is brutal. She loves Will. She's built a version of their relationship on trust, the same as anyone does. And now she's being handed a scenario that seems to directly contradict that trust, at a moment when Will himself can't offer her a clear, confident explanation, because he genuinely doesn't have one. Imagine being on the receiving end of, "I don't remember what happened," even if it's true, even if it's the most honest sentence Will has ever said to her. From Electra's side of the conversation, in the middle of hurt and suspicion, that sentence can sound like exactly what it would sound like from someone who has something to hide. Not because Electra is unreasonable, but because "I don't remember" is, unfortunately, one of the oldest excuses in existence, deployed for centuries by people who absolutely do remember and simply don't want to admit what they did. That's what makes Will's position so uniquely painful if this storyline unfolds the way it appears to be building. He's not lying. He's telling the truth in the most literal sense possible, but the truth in this case sounds indistinguishable from a lie, and he has no way to prove otherwise. Every attempt he makes to explain himself risks making him look worse, because uncertainty reads as evasiveness even when it isn't. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Luna gets to occupy a strange, protected position. She can stand back and let Will dig himself deeper into a hole made entirely of his own confusion, without needing to say another manipulative word. The chaos she may have set in motion is now, in a sense, running itself. But here's where the story starts to turn, and where Luna's plan, if it is one, begins to show its first real cracks. Because memory, even damaged memory, doesn't always stay gone. Sometimes it returns in pieces, unpredictable and disjointed, arriving at the worst possible moments and the best possible moments in equal measure. And that appears to be exactly what starts happening to Will. At first, it's nothing concrete. A flash of a voice that doesn't belong to anyone at his table. A face that shouldn't have been that close to him. A hand near his glass that he can't quite place, but that lingers in his mind longer than a random detail should. None of it forms a full picture yet, but it's enough to plant a question he hadn't let himself ask out loud before. What if this wasn't just alcohol? That single question changes everything about how Will processes the rest of his fragmented memories. Because once he allows himself to consider that someone may have interfered with him that night, every blank space in his recollection stops feeling like a simple consequence of drinking too much and starts feeling like a crime scene he's slowly, painfully reconstructing from the inside. He starts replaying the earlier part of the night with new scrutiny. He remembers feeling fine, not perfect, not stone sober, but fine, in the normal, familiar way a few drinks at a party feels fine. And then, according to what seems to be building in the story, that feeling shifts abruptly rather than gradually. The room tilts too fast. His thoughts thicken too suddenly. His body goes heavy in a way that doesn't match how many drinks he'd actually had. That kind of abrupt, disproportionate shift is exactly the detail that should make anyone pause, because it doesn't behave the way ordinary intoxication behaves. It behaves like something else entirely, something introduced rather than accumulated. And once Will starts noticing that discrepancy, he can't unsee it. This is the moment Luna, if she's responsible, should be the most afraid of, because Will is no longer simply a confused man trying to move past an embarrassing gap in his night. He's becoming an investigator into his own life, piecing together evidence from inside his own mind, and every fragment he recovers is a fragment she can no longer fully control. Put yourself in her position for a second, because understanding her fear here is important to understanding what she might do next. She built whatever version of that night she's been selling to Will and to Electra around one central assumption: that Will would never be able to challenge it, because he would never remember enough to do so. That assumption was the entire foundation of her plan. And now, piece by piece, that foundation is eroding. A person backed into that kind of corner rarely responds by simply admitting the truth. More often, they escalate, they double down, they become more present, not less, because retreating now would look exactly like guilt, and getting closer to Will might feel like the only way to control what he ultimately concludes. So don't be surprised if, instead of pulling away as Will's suspicion grows, Luna does the opposite. Inserts herself further into his orbit. Positions herself as someone concerned about him, someone trying to help him make sense of a night she claims to understand better than he does. It's a calculated move, because concern is much harder to accuse of malice than distance is. If she's hovering out of what looks like genuine worry, it becomes that much harder for Will, or for Electra, to see her as the architect of the entire situation. But every additional lie she tells to maintain that image adds one more thread that can eventually be pulled. And the more Will remembers, even in fragments, the more each of those threads becomes exposed to scrutiny it was never built to survive. Meanwhile, something is shifting on Electra's side of this as well, something quieter but just as important. Because anger, however justified it feels in the moment, tends to run out of fuel if it isn't being constantly fed by new evidence. And what Electra may start to notice, if she takes even a moment to actually look rather than simply react, is that Will's confusion doesn't behave like the confusion of a guilty man. Guilty men, generally, build increasingly detailed stories to cover their tracks. What Will appears to be offering Electra instead is the opposite: uncertainty, discomfort, and a genuine, visible struggle to reconstruct something that clearly disturbs him as much as it disturbs her. That's not the profile of someone hiding an affair. That's the profile of someone trying to process the possibility that he was a victim rather than the villain everyone, including himself for a while, assumed he was. If Electra allows herself to sit with that possibility, even briefly, an entirely different question starts to form. Not, what did Will do, but what was done to Will? And that question inevitably leads somewhere very specific, because there's really only one person in this entire story with the motive, the opportunity, and the emotional history to make that scenario plausible: Luna. Once that name enters Electra's suspicion instead of Will's, the entire emotional axis of this storyline flips. Instead of Electra standing in judgment of Will, the two of them may find themselves standing on the same side, looking for answers together, united against someone who may have deliberately tried to tear them apart. That doesn't undo the damage, though, and it's worth being honest about that. Even in the version where Will is proven completely innocent, where the manipulation is confirmed and Luna is exposed for exactly what she did, the emotional wreckage doesn't simply disappear the moment the truth comes out. Electra still had to live through the fear of believing her relationship was collapsing. Will still has to carry the knowledge that someone he trusted, or at least tolerated as part of his social orbit, was willing to violate his autonomy this completely to get what she wanted. Trust, once shaken that violently, doesn't snap back into place just because the facts eventually align in your favor. It takes longer than that. It takes work that the truth alone can't do on its own. And there's another layer to what Electra may be quietly carrying through all of this, one that rarely gets talked about directly, but shapes almost every version of this kind of storyline. It's the particular loneliness of not knowing who to believe. Electra isn't just choosing between trusting Will and doubting him. She's being asked, without ever explicitly being told, to weigh the word of the man she loves against the word of a woman who has positioned herself as calm, sympathetic, even concerned. Luna isn't likely to present herself as an obvious threat in front of Electra. She's far more likely to appear supportive, almost gentle, offering exactly the kind of quiet reassurance that makes her seem like the more trustworthy narrator of that night, precisely because Will can't compete with confidence when all he has to offer is uncertainty. That imbalance is what makes this kind of manipulation so effective in the short term and so corrosive in the long term. Electra isn't foolish for struggling to see through it. Nobody is built to instinctively distrust someone who sounds calm and caring, while the person they love sounds shaken and unsure. It's only with time, and with enough inconsistencies piling up, that the truth starts to outweigh the performance. And piling up those inconsistencies takes exactly the kind of scrutiny Electra may not be emotionally equipped to apply in the early, rawest days of believing her relationship has been betrayed. But before any of that healing can even begin, the truth itself still has to surface, and that's where this story appears to be heading next, toward a confrontation that neither Will nor Luna will be able to walk away from unchanged. Because the thing about a lie built on someone else's confusion is that it only works as long as the confusion lasts. The instant real memory starts returning, the entire structure becomes unstable. And Will, according to everything the story has been building toward, is getting closer to remembering more than fragments. He's getting closer to remembering enough to look at Luna directly and recognize something in her expression that doesn't match the story she's been telling him. Enough to notice that she knows details she shouldn't know if her version of events were true. Enough to finally ask her the one question she's been dreading since the night this all began. What did you do to me? That single confrontation, whenever it finally happens, is going to be one of the most charged moments this storyline produces, because it strips away every layer of manipulation Luna has relied on up to this point. She can't control a direct question asked by a man who is no longer confused enough to accept a vague answer. She can deflect. She can deny. She can try to turn the accusation back on him, suggesting he's misremembering, imagining things, letting paranoia distort what actually happened. But denial only works on someone who doesn't already suspect the truth, and will by that point, very much will. And that's usually the moment where people like Luna, cornered and out of convincing options, stop trying to maintain the story altogether and start trying to survive the consequences of it instead. Notice how differently a person behaves once they shift from protecting a lie to protecting themselves. The tone changes. The warmth she may have been performing toward Will starts to curdle into something closer to defensiveness, even hostility, because at that point she isn't trying to win him back anymore. She's trying to control the fallout before it reaches anyone who matters, which almost always means one thing: escalation, a bigger lie, a more dramatic claim, something designed not to restore her original story, because that's no longer salvageable, but to create enough new chaos that nobody has time to fully process the truth that's finally surfacing. Maybe she tries to destroy whatever evidence exists that could confirm what she did. Maybe she tries to convince the people around Will that he's spiraling, that his memories are unreliable, that grief or stress or paranoia is warping his perception of a night that was far more innocent than he's making it sound. Or maybe, and this is the possibility that would genuinely reshape the entire arc going forward, she reveals something else entirely. Something bigger than the missing hours themselves. A secret tied to that night that goes beyond a single manipulated evening and connects to something Luna has been protecting for much longer than anyone realized. We don't know that for certain, and it's important to say clearly that this is speculation rather than confirmed information. But the way this storyline has been constructed, layering confusion on top of manipulation, on top of a woman who has shown a consistent willingness to justify extreme behavior in pursuit of what she wants, suggests the show isn't building toward a simple resolution. It's building toward a reveal substantial enough to justify everything that came before it. And that's really the tension driving this entire arc forward right now. Not just whether Will remember what happened, because it seems increasingly likely that he will, piece by piece, until the picture is complete enough to act on. The real tension is what happens once he does. What Luna does when she realizes she's out of room to maneuver. What Electra does when she has to reconcile the relief of Will's innocence with the fear of how close she came to losing him over a lie she almost believed completely. Because even if the truth eventually protects Will and Electra's relationship, the version of events the show seems to be building toward suggests this isn't a story that ends neatly the moment the confusion clears. The truth rarely arrives all at once. It tends to leak out in uneven pieces, a fragment of memory here, a piece of evidence there, a witness who suddenly remembers something they didn't think mattered until now. Security footage nobody thought to check. A conversation someone overheard and dismissed at the time. A detail from that night that seemed irrelevant until it becomes the single thread that unravels everything Luna built. And once that unraveling begins, it rarely stays contained to just one relationship. If Luna is willing to go this far to isolate Will from Electra, that raises uncomfortable questions about what else she might be willing to justify to herself in pursuit of what she believes she deserves. This story, if it develops the way its current trajectory suggests, isn't really about one difficult night anymore. It's about a person whose sense of entitlement to someone else's life has grown dangerous enough that a single missing memory was never the whole plan. It may have only been the opening move. Think about how many small, easily overlooked details from that night could still be sitting out there, waiting to be noticed. A bartender who remembers exactly who ordered what and for whom. A guest who stepped outside for air and saw two people together who shouldn't have been alone. A phone that automatically backed up a photo nobody meant to keep. None of these things need to be dramatic on their own. That's precisely why they're dangerous to Luna. A single dramatic lie is something she can manage, deny, or explain away with enough confidence. A dozen small, disconnected details, each pointing quietly in the same direction, are almost impossible to control because she can't predict which one someone else will remember first, or when. This is usually how these storylines actually collapse, not through one grand confession, but through erosion. A comment made in passing that suddenly means something different in hindsight. A question asked out of simple curiosity that turns out to have a devastating answer. Somebody who wasn't even thinking about Will and Luna that night, who mentioned something offhand weeks later, with no idea they've just handed someone the missing piece of a puzzle they didn't know existed. If the show follows that kind of pattern, and there's every indication it will, then Luna's downfall may not come from one clean, satisfying reveal. It may come from a slow accumulation of small inconsistencies that eventually become impossible to explain away, no matter how convincingly she's rehearsed her story. That's also what makes Will's growing memory so much more dangerous to her than any single witness could be. A witness has a fragment. Will potentially has the whole picture, buried but recoverable, and unlike anyone else in this story, he has every possible motivation to keep pushing until he finds it. Will still has to live with what happened to him, regardless of how the confrontation eventually plays out. That's not something a single dramatic scene resolves. There's a particular kind of damage that comes from realizing your own body and mind were used against you by someone you should have been able to trust, even in a limited, ordinary way. And that damage doesn't disappear the moment the truth becomes public. It lingers in smaller ways, in how he trusts new situations, in how he processes nights he can't fully control, in how carefully he starts watching the people around him, wondering who else might be capable of something like this. Electra, for her part, has to reconcile two conflicting truths at once. The relief of knowing Will didn't betray her, and the unsettling knowledge that she came dangerously close to ending their relationship over a manipulation she couldn't have easily detected. That's not a comfortable place to sit, even once the anger fades. It raises its own quiet question, one she may never say out loud. How many other moments in their relationship might have been shaped by people around them without either of them realizing it? And Luna, if this is the direction the story ultimately takes, has to face something she's likely avoided facing for a long time. That obsession, no matter how convincingly it disguises itself as love inside her own mind, always eventually collides with consequence. The version of Luna who told herself she was simply fighting for what she wanted may not survive contact with the version of herself Will and Electra are about to see clearly for the first time. There's something almost tragic buried inside that reckoning, even for a character whose actions are this difficult to defend. Because the moment the mask comes off, Luna doesn't just lose Will, she loses the story she's been telling herself about who she is. For as long as the deception held, she got to imagine herself as the woman who simply loved harder, who refused to give up, who saw something worth fighting for and fought for it. Once the truth is out in the open, that self-image collapses along with everything else. What's left isn't a woman who fought for love. It's a woman who took something from someone else that was never hers to take. And there's no framing clever enough to make that sound like romance once everyone else can finally see it clearly too. That's often the most uncomfortable part of watching a storyline like this play out. Not just the damage done to the victims, but the slow, inevitable unraveling of the person who caused it, watching them lose their own justification in real time, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to hide behind. The real question hanging over everything right now isn't whether Luna's secret comes out. At this point, given how the pieces are falling into place, it feels less like a question of if and more a question of when, and how much collateral damage happens in the process of getting there. The bigger question is what she does in the meantime. Because someone cornered rarely goes quietly, and everything about Luna's pattern so far suggests she's not the type to accept exposure without a fight. If she has one more move left, one final piece of leverage she's been holding in reserve, this is exactly the moment she would use it. Not to fix what's already broken, because that ship may have already sailed, but to make sure that whatever comes next hurts Will and Electra as much as the exposure is about to hurt her. That's the version of this storyline worth watching closely in the episodes ahead. Not just whether Will fully remembers that night, but what he does with that memory once it's whole. Not just whether Electra believes him, but how she processes the fact that she almost didn't. And not just whether Luna gets caught, but what she's willing to do in the moments right before that happens, when she has nothing left to lose and everything already slipping through her fingers. Because right now, this story is sitting in its most dangerous phase. The truth is close enough to see, but not close enough to be safe. Will is remembering, but not everything. Electra is suspecting, but not certain. And Luna is cornered, but not finished. Somewhere in that gap between almost knowing and finally knowing, anything is possible. And if this storyline follows the pattern it's been building toward, the most explosive moment isn't the one we've already seen unfold. It's the one still waiting, just past the edge of what any of them can currently see coming. One celebration, one manipulated drink, if the darkest reading proves true, one missing night that refused to stay buried. That's how this began, but the way it ends may be the part nobody watching saw coming at all. If you want to be here when the next piece of this story breaks, make sure you're subscribed, because this one is far from finished, and the fallout is only getting started.